Hey guys, welcome to another episode of The Completionist. I'm back for the winter break, guys. So even though I've been home since early December and my time home is at the halfway point, I thought now would be a good time to actually get some videos made, for my YouTube channel. I really wanted to dedicate, the first half of my time home, to spending some quality time with the missus, and and taking time out, to see a lot of my really close friends that I really missed, while I was working up in Alberta during the pandemic. So I don't have to go back until April the 2nd, as long as things are looking good pandemic-wise. So I still got 2 months left for my winter breaks. So I wanted to take this time and get some videos made. So guys, the first video that I wanted to talk about is, I wanted to talk about console launches and why I've never really been a part of them. And I thought this would make for a really good topic because back in November of last year, we had the release of the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and the Series S systems. And even at the release of these systems, I had no desire of getting them. And, it made me kind of reflect back on my childhood, and it made me realize that, as a kid and as a teenager, and even as a young adult, I have never ever got a video game system at release. It's just something that's never really appealed to me. And I want to take a deep dive into why that is. And, I've always been someone I consider myself always behind the times. It's never a huge priority in my life to keep up with technology or, with what some of the current trends are when it comes to media and, all those things. And I think one of those reasons is, I think it's just because of how I was brought up and where I actually lived. Now, for people who have watched this channel before, a lot of you are very well aware, I grew up in a small fishing community in Newfoundland of like less than 300 people. And the nearest hub where you could like do any shopping, any commercial shopping or like anything like that, was in a community 10 minutes away, but that community was only about 2,000 people. So, and even in that community of 2,000 people, video game merchandise was actually incredibly hard to get. I remember that the first video game system that I actually owned was the Atari 2600, and we didn't get that until the mid-1980s. And then eventually as a kid, we got the NES, and we didn't get an NES until the late 1980s. And then we didn't get a Super Nintendo until 1991, 92. I think it was 91 that we ended up getting it. But it's just the fact of growing up in a very small community, you just didn't have access to a lot of resources. And for as much as being a kid and you would see commercials and you'd see products, in the Sears Christmas catalog, that's something a lot of Newfoundlanders and a lot of Canadians can remember looking at. We used to get the Sears Wish Book in September, October, and we'd all want to go through it and see everything that that they were offering, especially in the toy section. And the toy section was always in the very back of the Wish Book, and that's how we got to know about video game systems and video games and things like that. But especially back in the 1980s and the early 1990s, things were stupid expensive, which is one of my pet peeves, especially when it comes to current gaming culture, is that I always hear people complain about, video games are too expensive, the PlayStation 5 and the new Xbox releases are like 70 and 80 bucks, and I'm just thinking, guys, like, I specifically remember, going to Shoppers Drug Mart and looking in the glass case at the video games, and SNES games were going from anywhere from $90 to $100. And a lot of SNES games, if it wasn't an RPG, you could beat in an hour. You know, a lot of games these days, you know, are huge time sinks. Like you're like to even for a first person shooter that you could probably beat in maybe 5 to 10 hours. Like if you bought an NES game and an SNES game and you got 5 to 10 hours out of it, that is a godsend. You were getting your max playability out of that game. And I remember, especially as a kid, video games were a luxury purchase. Were an incredibly luxurious purchase because not a lot of people had $100 to spend on a cartridge to give you maybe an hour or a couple of hours of entertainment. And I think gamers these days are incredibly spoiled because the games these days, you can put hundreds and thousands of hours and still get a ton of entertainment into it. But I think, you know, as a kid and as a teenager, you know, one of the things when it came to console releases is that as much as you wanted to own it, you just didn't have the means to. And that's why, especially as a kid and as a teenager, you know, as badly as you wanted something, you know, you just had to realize that, you know, the cards weren't in your favor, especially, you know, because of location and maybe personal finances. And, you know, especially if you were a kid in the 80s and 90s, you know, a video game system was a luxurious purchase. And not a lot of people didn't have that luxury. You know, I remember, it's like I said that the Atari 2600, you know, was the first video game system I ever owned. But before we actually owned a Nintendo Entertainment System or a Super Nintendo, we actually rented the system to actually try it. You know, when video game system rentals used to be a thing, I don't think that they exist anymore. We used to rent an NES all the time, but even that didn't happen very often. And then eventually, you know, we got to own our own NES, but you didn't really have that much of an opportunity, you know, to own games for it. You know, I don't even think there was a place in my community or in the town next over where you could actually buy NES games. You know, I remember when the Super Nintendo came out, it's like I said before, you know, the Shoppers Drug Mart in our local mall used to have a Super Nintendo case, and that was the first time I ever seen video games for sale. And I think out of all the times throughout my entire teenage years, I think I only maybe bought sorry, 2 or 3 games from that case because, you know, they were stupid expensive. And it's just, and unfortunately back in those days, you know, that there weren't a lot of families that, you know, that could throw $90 to $100 around. And it's just that it was just a harsh reality that I kind of had to deal with, to know that I would never be able to get something, you know, when it was released. So I just simply accepted it just as a harsh reality of life. And, you know, and as a kid and as a teenager, you know, the Super Nintendo was the last video game system that I actually owned before I ended up going to college. And even though the Nintendo 64 came out in 1996, I think my parents were pretty fed up with video games and they weren't going to get me anymore, and I think they just wanted me to focus on my studies. So, you know, throughout being 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, you know, I was just playing my Super Nintendo all the time, you know, while everyone else was playing PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. So hang on guys, just gotta take a drink. Throat's getting dry. So now we get into university. And it's the same thing. You know, a lot of people that I lived with in residence, you know, they had their own video game systems, and I didn't have one. And it's just you know, the PlayStation got released. I don't think I even got my very first PlayStation until like 1999. and the first game that I got for it, was Final Fantasy VII. It was something that my brother and I had to share, and unfortunately I couldn't take the system with me back to university because my brother was still in high school, so we had to keep it home. And even when it came to the PlayStation 2, I got that a couple of years. I think at least a year or two after its release, because the first 3 games that I ever bought for the PlayStation 2 was Wild Arms 3, Xenosaga Episode 1, and Kingdom Hearts. And then that was the last video game system that I owned under my parents' umbrella when I was still living with my parents. Going to when I used to finish up my college semesters and that kind of thing, and then I eventually, moved in with my wife, and been with her ever since. But that trend has always continued, even though when my wife and I were together, we were still avid gamers. We were together before the Xbox 360 and the PS3 came out. But we still played a PlayStation and PlayStation 2. But it's just, even throughout our time together, and video game systems would still get released afterwards, we never had any desire to ever get them when they were first released. Because I think as video gaming has gotten more popular, obviously it's become more of a rat race when it comes to getting a system at launch. And I guess my wife and I's perception of it is that it just wasn't worth the hassle. I remember, when the Wii had come out, and everybody wanted it, and there was a huge shortage of them, and that was the first time that I really seen video game system scalping at its absolute scummiest. And for me, it just wasn't worth being a part of it. I think my sentiments, towards that have just evolved over time. That video game releases and video game system releases just aren't that big of a deal to me anymore. Because if it ends up being something that I'm going to enjoy, there's really no rush for me to get it. I don't see the point of being the first to own it or being the first to play it. And it's just, there's no reason for me to own a video game system if games are not going to come out for it that I'm not going to like. And it's just like, I'm not going to buy a system just for the sake of buying it. And in all honesty, I'm kind of happy that, I don't keep up with the current gaming trends anymore. Because especially with all the shenanigans that happened with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X and Series S, and all these horrible stories of people scalping them, and of bots buying a ton of them on specific shopping websites, and then reselling for like double or even triple the price. And for me, that's just not worth it for me. Because it doesn't matter for me what type of technology comes out. There's absolutely no rush for me to get it. Because eventually, it may take a couple of years, but eventually they'll become available. And it's just that, for me, especially when it comes to playing a game on a specific console, if I haven't played the game before, playing the game on its release has no more of a different impact than if I played the game 3 years after its release. And a case in point is in Christmas of 2020, I bought my wife a Nintendo Switch. And the Nintendo Switch got released in 2017, so it's a 3-year-old system. And I remember when the Switch first came out, they were incredibly hard to find. But there was no rush for me to get it. They didn't really release any games that I had a particular interest in it, so I waited for the system to become more readily available, and I waited for games to be released for that system. And currently, right now, like I said, we have our Switch and we only have one game for it, which is Octopath Traveler, which my wife and I have been playing together, and we've actually really enjoyed. And it's just, I think I've reached that point when it comes to console launches that I'm not going to buy a console until it releases a game that I actually want to play. And to actually have a system and a game get released, at the same time, barely happens. When my wife and I got our PlayStation 4, we didn't get a PlayStation 4 until Final Fantasy 15 came out, because that was the only game that we wanted to play for the system at that time. So there was no reason at all to get the system at launch, because I have more than enough games to play right now across various previous generations. And console launches have kind of lost their allure to me. It's just that I've kind of adopted the mentality that regardless of how old a game is, if I've never played it before, it's still a new and enthralling experience to me, regardless of how old it is. Like currently, I'm playing Residence of Fate right now for the PS3. The game that is known as having the worst timing when it came to being launched, because it got released, I think, the same time as Final Fantasy 13. So because of that, it got completely ignored. And obviously, Final Fantasy 13, stole its spotlight. But I've actually been really enjoying it, especially its really unique battle system. But especially in the days of current console launches, in my eyes, it's just not worth it. Scalping's a huge problem when it comes to console launches right now. And I do have to applaud, some of my friends who are some of the greatest trolls on the face of the planet, because back in November and December of this year, some of them were messing with some of these scalpers really bad, and rightly so, because as far as I'm concerned, you're greedy bastards. And I think if somebody takes time out of their day to fuck with you, all the power to them. Because if you want to let your life be controlled by greed, then you're going to get destroyed by greed. And I've had some of my friends, make some of these scalpers drive long distances, waste gas money, waste their time, with correspondence, of not planning on buying all these systems that they're hoarding, and things along those lines. And you know what? And for my friends who are trolls, and who you are, all the power to you. I got nothing but the greatest respect for you. And for those guys, never buy your system from a scalper. Don't. Just learn to be patient, because you'll eventually get the system. You may not be the first to get the system, or you may be one of the last. But in all honesty, does it really matter if you do own the system at launch, or if you do own a system, right after launch? I would like to think that the majority of the games will still be available that you want to play, unless it's something that has like online functionality or things along those lines. Even though I'm playing a lot of older systems these days, one of the harsh realities for me, especially as a completionist, is that a lot of online achievements or trophies I'll never be able to get because they belong taken down the servers, because it's taking me this long to actually get a chance to play these games. But you know what? I'm perfectly okay with it. I've always considered being patient to be one of my strongest attributes, and it's just I've never ever been one to ever keep up with the times. I'll get around to it when I get around to it. And I think it was just my upbringing as a child that, obviously, you would get excited, to see something new, and, you'd want it, but then the harsh reality would set in, and you'd realize that, you can't always, get what you want. And, I always hear these stories of, parents, complaining to scalpers, oh, you ruined my kid's Christmas by charging so much. And I'm just thinking to myself, like, my parents always had a great attitude, and they had a great way of going about things when I asked for something for Christmas as a kid or as a teenager, and more specifically as a kid, because because a lot of kids believe in Santa Claus, and you ask for something, and you'll say, will Santa Claus bring it? And my parents would always say, well, we'll see. It's Santa Claus can't make such and such for every kid in the world. So if he has one available, you might get it or you might not. But I think one of the most important lessons I learned growing up is that life isn't always fair. And it's just that, for me, I'm not going to stand in line. I'm not going to get excited over a console launch, especially when it's something I could probably get maybe a year or 2 years down the road, when they're more readily available. I've never been one of those types of people that I feel the need to keep up with what's current and what's popular, the whole keeping up with the Joneses syndrome. Just because they got something, I need to get it. That's just never really appealed to me. So, but listen, if you are a gamer and you've been a part of various console launches, ultimately, there's there's nothing wrong with that. If you're one of the lucky ones, to get it legitimately, and and you're enjoying it to your heart's content, that's all that matters. But ultimately, the impact that a console launch has on you on opening day pretty much has the same impact on me if I don't decide to get that console 2 or 3 years down the road. I've just learned to be more patient, especially as I've gotten older. And that's why when it comes to the PlayStation 5, because I have no interest in the Xbox Series X at all, I probably won't get a PlayStation 5 unless Final Fantasy 16 gets released or Final Fantasy 7 Part 2. And I'm perfectly happy waiting for that, waiting that time to actually get one, because I have more than enough stuff to play. When I look back on it, I think the closest that I've ever come to ever getting a system at launch was a PlayStation Portable. I think I bought it from one of my wife's friends 6 months after it got released, because it was something that I thought my wife could really enjoy. But I made the horrible mistake that when I bought it, there was really no games for it that got released that my wife would enjoy, because we're hardcore JRPG players, and even though the PSP has an amazing JRPG library now, when it was first released, it did not. And I think the first JRPG I think we bought for the PSP was the Valkyrie Profile Lenneth, because when I bought it from my wife's friend, it came with 2 games, which was Luminous and Twisted Metal Black, and my wife had no desire to play any of those games. But I think 6 months. I think 6 months was the closest that I ever got to buying a system at the console release. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed that story of console launches and why I've never really been a part of them. So anyway, guys, I hope to make more video content over the next 2 months. So as always, take care, and I wish you nothing but the best. Later.